there can often be a lot of talk about, good and bad reasons for choosing child-free or choosing to have kids. I think it's more about like, is it a good or bad reason for you? Having that honesty with ourselves is really important. And I do think that not just doing it because it's the thing we're seeing other people doing, but really being like, why do I personally want this or why do I not want this?
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to How the Wise One Grows. So today we get to talk about a really, really big life question, and that is the decision to have kids or not. But before we dive into this really important conversation, let's just take a moment to land here together with 3 deep breaths. So just take a moment to notice where your body makes contact with the earth. And if it's safe right now, you can gently rest your eyes or soften your gaze. Maybe even drop your shoulders down the back. Inhale, fill your chest, fill your belly with air. Exhale, open your mouth, let it out. Inhale, chest and belly expand. Exhale, let it all go. One more inhale. And exhale. And return to that point of contact with the earth as you slowly open your eyes and return to this space. I am so excited for this conversation. I know I say that about all of our episodes, but I feel like this is a particularly juicy one. And to guide us in this conversation, listeners have sent in their thoughts and questions about this topic, and we have Keltie Maguire, a clarity coach, to guide us. So just a bit about Keltie. Keltie began speaking about her decade-long struggle to decide whether to have kids or stay child-free, and her eventual arrival at the decision to embrace a child-free life. Keltie began hearing from countless women who related to her story and felt largely invisible and unsupported in the decision-making process. She now helps women who are stuck like she was to get clarity on whether motherhood or a child-free path is for them, so they can live a joyful, dynamic, and fulfilling life no matter the choice. Keltie, thank you so much for being here and for having this conversation with us today. For me personally, I didn't really realize that it got to be a question to have kids or not until I got to a place in my life where I could. I guess I could for a while, but where it was more of a reality. Yeah. So thank you so much for holding space for us to talk about this question.
You are most welcome. And that's something that I hear from so many people. And that was my experience as well. I mean, I think intellectually I knew that there was a choice, but based on what I was seeing around me, and I guess sort of the precedent that was set by women in my life, having kids was just what you did or would do. So I also didn't question that until I really came to this sort of crisis of faith of, is this actually what I want for myself? Is this that right path for me?
Yeah. Do you mind sharing briefly about your story of deciding if you wanted to have kids or not and how you finally made that decision?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think, perhaps as some listeners might be able to relate, growing up, I had the assumption that I would one day become a mom. I grew up in a really, I guess, quite traditional household, mom, dad. There were 3 of us kids. I was the eldest, the only daughter. And although it wasn't something that was openly spoken about as far as this is the expectation for you, again, it was just what I saw modeled around me. And to be honest, it didn't occur to me until much, much later, probably in my early 30s or mid 30s, that I really had not a single role model of a woman in particular, but I want to say almost people in general that had not gone on to have kids at some point, whether through becoming birth parents or whether adoption, what have you. Everyone, it seemed in my life, whether aunts and uncles, family, friends, they were all parents. And so the assumption was that I would do this at some point, but it would be later. And so I treated it as a later problem, if you will, a later question, because for a long time I was preoccupied with, of course, growing up, becoming a young adult, going to university, finding myself in different
Mm-hmm.
relationships. I was doing a lot of traveling. I was living overseas for a time. And it was really only, I would say, in my later 20s after meeting my now husband. I was 26, or pardon me, 27 when we met, that I started to question more, like, not even so much do I want kids, but when are we going to have kids?
Mm.
And I think this was really based on what I saw going around me, which is that other people were getting married and having children. And although there was a lot of me that this idea of having kids didn't really appeal to me on various levels, I thought that I would still do it. It was just like, I'm not ready now. It was a constantly this feeling of I'm not ready, not now. And again, maybe people can relate to this idea of like, once I do this, once we do that, when we're 30, when we're 32, then maybe that's something that we'll pursue. And the interesting thing is, I found myself in this wonderful relationship with this man who would be an incredible father, really, knowing this would hopefully be my life's relationship, my big love.
Mm-hmm.
And although I had this great foundation in terms of my relationship, and I had gone to school and I was doing work I loved and I had this support, and I guess I felt well resourced in a sense to have a child, it was something I still didn't want. And I would say I became quite increasingly consumed with this question, like when, and maybe at some point I thought, if I have a child, I guess the realization slowly dawned on me, that maybe this is something I wouldn't do. But I became so consumed with it that I finally told myself that I was going to stop thinking about it because I wasn't coming to conclusions, and that I would make a decision when I was 35. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason I picked this magic number 35, and it's one that people may be, nodding their heads as you are, this is when we've been told as women that our fertility, there's sort of the fertility drop off. And there's actually, some truth, and also that's not entirely true that happens, but this was the number in my head. Okay, 35, I'll figure it out. So I thought, like, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
leave this until the 11th hour.
Yeah.
And again, like my husband and I, we'd often say, like, when we have kids or later, like the talking was that we'd have children, but there was nothing very firm or fixed about that. And so 35 arrived, and I still didn't know if it was what I wanted. And I just kind of kept pushing it off, pushing it off. And at that point in time, and I'm trying to remember now, so I'm 41, 6 years ago almost, I moved from Vancouver, Canada to Munich, Germany, which is where I'm now based. And I want to say that partly I think the move was precipitated by this idea that I saw everyone around me eventually getting married, having a child or children, or at least planning or trying to. And I felt like my husband and I, life was kind of stagnant or standing still. And it wasn't bad. It was great. I had a business I loved. He was doing work he enjoyed. We had a really, really good, rich life. And yet people were moving to the suburbs. They're consumed with, kids are growing up, they're going to school. And so we decided also, but he's German. So, we'd always had this thought or agreement that we would live on his side of the world for some point. And so we moved here in 2018. And in my mind, it was also this idea of like, let's do something that we want for ourselves, where we're really like enacting change in our own life, as opposed to just sitting around feeling like, okay, well, we're the people without kids and everything else is happening, and that's not really what we want. And so it's so funny to think back, because I remember friends asking me like, so are the two of you going to have kids? And I would always say, maybe, we're not sure. I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not, maybe. And after coming here, I want to say probably within a year or so of arriving in Germany, I thought, I have to decide. Like, I could see 40 approaching.
Mm-hmm.
I, at this point, have been with my partner probably for 10 years, and I thought nothing's changing. Like, I can think about this question for the rest of my life. Opportunity to have kids, if that exists for me, would pass me by. And so I had to really do a lot of soul searching, and also commit to a decision-making process. Like, not just hope that the answer would come to me, but actually say, I'm going to go out and find it. Because what so many of us are told is that, don't worry about it. You'll just know. You'll just know when it's
Mm-hmm.
time to become a mom. You'll just know when it's time to have kids. You'll just know this is what you want. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm now 35, 36, 37 years old. I don't just know. And so I
Mm-hmm.
started working with a life coach. I started really engaging with the topic. I became what I call child-free curious. So really noticing that there were communities of women who had actively chosen this path for themselves. And where I ultimately ended up was feeling like I don't belong on either side. I don't identify with the moms that I know. And I want to say that I knew women who, sure, since, I wanted to be a mother since I was a young girl, I had friends like that. But I also knew women who said, meh, I'm not really sure if it's what I want. I'm not really sold on it. I'm kind of ambivalent. It doesn't sound that great to me. And ultimately they would become moms. And for me,
Mm-hmm.
that was always this feeling of like, it's not personal abandonment, but sort of this feeling of it's inevitable. Of course I'm going to have a child. And so I didn't identify with any of that. And yet when I saw the child-free community or communities online, I also did not identify with this really, strong sort of position of likewise, never wanted it. Kids are gross, parenting's
Mm-hmm.
stupid, like lots of really kind of negative perspectives on this all. And I thought, what is wrong with me? I feel so weird. There must be something wrong with me. Like, do I need to go to the doctor and get my hormones checked? Am I broken as a woman? Why am I so unfeminine? Like, what is wrong with me? Is this because of what happened to me, in my youth? Is it whatever? That said, slowly, and it was really a process, I came to not just recognize that I wanted to stay child free, but that it was more of an acceptance of that desire. I
Mm-hmm.
think for a time I had recognized that becoming a mom was not for me. And yet I was judging myself because of the messaging that we get that that is not the okay thing to do. And so, I guess to sort of wrap up my long story, which is of course very abbreviated, it was really about starting to show myself some compassion and understanding that this, I believe, is just who I am or who I've become through the experiences I've had in my life, and that there's nothing wrong with not knowing, with feeling ambivalent, and there's nothing wrong with choosing a child-free path. So it's been a few years since that point, and as you shared in your lovely intro, I've now heard from so many other folks of all genders saying like, this is my story too. I totally identify with this. I don't know what I want. I don't know which is for me. So
Mm-hmm. Oh, Keltie, there, everything you just said, I am so excited to dive deeper into. And as you were talking and you said the term child free curious, it reminds me a lot. A few weeks ago, I believe it was episode 88, I'll have it linked in the show notes. We did a series of sober curious conversations. And I believe Ruby Warrington founded the term sober curious
she did.
and has written Women About Kids about
Women
this
without
topic as
kids. Yeah.
well. Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to start questioning things like this. Like when I heard the term sober curious, I was like, I had no idea that that was me. And I also like didn't really have, this is silly to say, but like I didn't really process that not drinking was an option if you like weren't an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like I thought like, oh, like you have to have a really hardcore reason to not drink. And now I don't have any issues with alcohol. I just don't do it. I don't drink because I don't like it.
Yeah.
And it feels like to me this conversation about the decision to have kids or not really roots in the heart of this podcast, which is like, how can we live with intention and authenticity?
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you are holding space for people to explore this very important decision within themselves.
Thank you.
And how you talked about, my background is in mindfulness. And when you were talking about as you came to your decision to not have kids, it seems like two ingredients that really supported you in that were steeping in radical acceptance and radical self-compassion. Because there are so many stories from society we're getting that are telling us so many other things about like, oh, it's unnatural to be a woman and not want to have kids. It's shameful, it's selfish. Like the list can go on, and we'll dive deeper into that. But I think that capacity to really listen to yourself and meet all of those parts with acceptance and compassion is like kind of the secret sauce to everything.
100%. Yeah. And I love what you said about really like at the root of this all, it's about living with intention and being conscious and conscientious. And it's something that we're not taught to do. It's like we follow this script, we act as we see others around us acting, and we never stop to ask ourselves, is this for me? Is this a right path? And those who question it, of course, were effectively scorned for doing so. And we're told that that's not
Yes.
the normal thing in the normal way.
Absolutely. And, that choice is being taken away from so many people too.
Of
And
course.
acknowledging like we do have agency in this decision, and deserve that autonomy.
100%. It's a privilege. I tell people,
It is.
if you have an opportunity to make this decision, that is one that so many women in this world, for a multitude of reasons, don't have. And so if you have that privilege, like, choose wisely and choose consciously. It's a gift to be able to do that.
We now have a free intentional living community on Discord where you can come together with fellow listeners to reflect on the conversations we've had on the podcast. We not only talk about the podcast, but really all the things that support us in living with intention. There's also a link in the show notes to join this free community, and I would be honored to have you there. We actually had a listener submit a question about people who identify in the queer community. They wanted to know, if it's something that people in the queer community have an easier experience with that decision, being a part of a community where it's more normalized to not have children, or if it's something that they do regret later in life. And, obviously there's no one answer to identify for a whole community, but I really heard what that listener said around like being in a community where it's more normalized might make that experience more supportive.
Yeah. No, it's definitely something to consider. And I think, as with, certainly any identity we may have, there's going to be challenges, and there's also going to be perhaps like, benefits, if you will, or things that are made easier. And, for example, some people say, like, for example, gender roles are a really big concern for a lot of people in cis heterosexual, partnerships. And so that is something that you may not see, for example, with two women who are in partnership, because there's more of an understanding of how those roles might be split and what that might look like, or less of an assumption, I should say, of how those things might be, not even just within the relationship, but like external to it. I think a lot of times heterosexual couples say, we want to have that balance, or we want things to be equitable, but that's not always what happens based on how the world has been set up to support or not support them.
Yeah. And even as someone in a female body, like, I don't think it will ever be equitable, because this is directly impacting my body and impacting me on like a cellular level. No matter how supportive your partner is and how much you try to split roles, like, if you are the one that's having a human come out of your body, that is an entirely different thing.
Yeah.
And there's so many risks about having a kid and what that does to you and your physical health that people don't talk about. And,
100%.
The more women I speak to who are in this phase of trying to get pregnant, having miscarriages, having really hard illnesses arise because of these things, it's just something that women are not nearly supported enough around. And I think it's a really important element to call into the conversation, is like the physical risk it puts women at.
Yeah. And oftentimes so much more than need be, right? You look at maternal mortality rates in places like the US, I believe the UK as well, especially among populations like the Black population community, for example. It's like, it's horrible, and those deaths should not be happening. But the fact of the matter is, as it stands now, there are greater risks specifically for certain groups of women. So.
Yeah. So one listener sent in this question that I kind of want to step into. I'll play their response. The audio on this one's a little spotty, but it's short, so just bear with me on that.
I am a 31-year-old female who is child-free. I have always pretty much felt like I would not have kids, and still feel about 95% that I do not want to have children. Although, as I am starting to age and my biological clock is beginning to tick, and if I did have kids, I definitely would prefer not to be an older mom. So my question is, are there specific questions that you recommend asking oneself to help to find that clarity, especially if you are feeling like you are more likely than not going to have children?
Yeah, so that question coming in is just like, where do people start when they're trying to decide if they want to have kids or not?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. And what I want to recommend is, first of all, being okay with being in discomfort and uncertainty, which nobody's really okay with, right? We hate that. And that's part of what makes this tricky, is not just the enormity of this decision, but the fact that it feels so bad not knowing. And there's so much doubt around what's going to happen if I make the wrong decision. But being okay with where you're at and recognizing that there are so many other people who also either feel or have felt this way. I know I hear from a lot of people like that's brought them a lot of comfort. For example, finding myself in our community. Second of all, what I really recommend, and again, this is tough to do, but is to set aside the question of, do I want to have children or not? And really look at, how do I want to live? How do I want my life to look? Yeah. So doing like a zoom out approach, if you will, or what I like to call it is, starting on the macro level and moving more to the micro. And so looking at things like, really, what are my priorities in life? How do I want to spend my time and energy? What are my unique wants, needs, and desires? And these are questions that we are so seldom encouraged to ask that, I can't tell you the number of people in the work that I do as a clarity coach who I ask them, whether it concerns career, this decision, what have you, what do you want? And the answer is, I don't know. I have no idea what I want. And there are, of course, so many reasons that we are disconnected from our bodies, from our own wisdom, from our inner knowing. But again, taking that do I want to have children question out of the equation and just being like, what do I know for sure about how I want to live my life, what my values are, what my priorities are, etc. And the more
I
we
love
can,
that.
yeah.
I like to think of it as like, the question isn't necessarily like if you want to have kids, but it's like, what are the potential life paths that you can pursue? I love that reframe. Sorry to cut you off though.
No, not at all. I'm glad you find that helpful. And it's ultimately about like setting the stage, so to speak, or thinking about this as like a canvas upon which we're then going to like draw a picture. First, we need to look at, what's this canvas we're working with? And of course, there may be certain things that we learn about ourselves in our lives that are going to be compatible with both paths, but there also may be realizations that a person has that makes them say or give pause to, ooh, I'm not sure if having children is going to be that right thing for me. So that can be a good starting point. And that's work that's going to serve us in all areas of our life, and it's continuous. It's not like we say, okay, now I know myself, therefore now I can make this decision. But again, becoming more well acquainted with ourselves. And we can do that through journaling or through working with a coach or therapist or through meditation and just doing reflection, but really asking ourselves some of those fundamental questions. The other thing to look at is really, what are the key sort of fears that are keeping me stuck in this decision? So what am I really afraid of when I look at either decision, or maybe that, let's say the path that I'm really considering pursuing? And so in my case, I was strongly leaning towards staying child free. And when I thought about like, what about that scares me, that's preventing me from really leaning into it, it was the classic things that a lot of people are going to say and think is like, what if I regret it when I get older? What if I die alone? What if it was future tripping, right? And those questions are worth certainly unpacking, exploring. And there are certain things that we can do to help manage and calm those fears. And second to fears, it's also about looking at the beliefs that we have about like, what does that mean if I choose that? Like, if I am a woman who doesn't have kids, what does that mean about me? What do I think or feel about myself? What do I perceive others are now going to think about me? The belief might be, I'm going to be, an outsider amongst my friends and family if I don't have kids. And so again, taking a deeper look at that and really looking at, our own beliefs. And then if there are ways to reshape those in such that they will serve us better, to like, it's like by really looking these things in the face, so to speak, it can help us clear the way, like looking at our monsters and being our demons and saying, okay, who are you? Then we can really start to actually connect with what we want, because we're clearing away the weeds, so to speak.
Yeah, that reminds me, a lot of what you're saying, I feel like is really steeped in mindfulness work and that belief system of like noticing what are the stories you're telling yourself about this? What is that soundtrack in your head? And then I really love Byron Katie and the 4 questions about like, um, is this belief true?
Yeah.
Can I absolutely know it to be true? And then I think it's like, what if this belief wasn't true?
Mm-hmm.
It allows you to really settle with like, what stories am I telling myself? What realities, quote unquote, am I painting for myself that might not actually be there? And
Yeah.
how can I reframe this, and not even like reframe, but like take a new perspective and take a
Yeah.
new seat in the way I relate to these societal stories and these stories that are in my mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love Byron Katie's 4 questions. Those are so good, and they could be so
Yeah.
good for doing this sort of beliefs work. I want to add that I think there's a point that we can get to with that where intellectually we know or believe something else. So we say, of course, it's fine to choose a child free path, for example.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's something else to really like embody that and to feel it. And I think for a lot of us, it's more of like an emotional or even physical sort of sensation that we have that like something is amiss or something feels unsafe. And so there's no one size fits all solution for that, except to advise that like there are different modalities that we can sort of employ and that it's something that takes time. And I
Mm-hmm.
also think it's about compiling the evidence. As I say, I like to think of myself as a bit of a detective. Like how can we like
Yes.
put on her magnifying glass or her seeing eye
Mm-hmm.
and think about what evidence do I have to support a different belief. So if we say it's fully normal to choose the child free path, to look at, who do I regard as being like a very, normal, healthy, well adjusted person, if you want. Of course we can also look at what is normal. Do I want to be normal? But like really looking at assembling a new way of viewing the world based on experiences we've had, based on people we know, based on all these other things that we know to be true that may be outside of this arena. Like, for example, if we feel really fearful, to ask ourselves, when have I felt really fearful making a big decision and yet it served me well despite my uncertainty? And
Mm.
so knowing I've done this before, it's okay for people not to like what I choose. Oh, there
Mm-hmm.
was that time I switched my program at university and I dropped out of med school and my parents were pissed off or whatever. That can then reinforce like, yeah, but that served me and that was good and that was hard, but they got over it. Or they didn't, but like I
Mm-hmm.
dealt with it. So
Yeah, developing that deep sense of self-trust within yourself.
yeah. Yeah, that's a big piece for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you were listening to that and just thought, darn, like I really wish I was taking notes for that, don't worry, I nerded out for you and I have created a kids or child free cheat sheet based off of Keltie's wisdom from today's conversation. So just click the link in the show notes to get the guide. Oh, and also, if you don't already, you should totally support this podcast by joining the Dream Team for as little as $3 a month. There is also a link in the show notes to join and support the operating costs of this lovely offering.
I want to share from this next listener. They were kind of reflecting on some of the hardest parts about making the decision making process for themselves.
Mm,
And this one I love because it came from a man, which I know most of
awesome.
this conversation is around women. It's easier to talk about when we are women, but
Yeah.
it is important, I think, to acknowledge that it's a choice that you should absolutely make for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily one that happens in isolation.
Yeah.
We're often working with another partner. So that's another layer of the dynamic we have to sift through. But here is a submission from our next listener.
Growing up, I never really thought about what being a dad could look like. I never envisioned myself as a dad, and it's only in the last couple of years now that I'm married and more people around me that are my like contemporaries are having kids, do I think about what it would be like for me to also be a father. And it really mostly just terrifies me. I think that fear of like messing up or not being good at it is probably the biggest thing that's holding me back. And also just not knowing if it's something that, like, is it something that I really want to do, or does it just look like fun on Instagram? I guess is the like, I have no idea what it would be like. And maybe it's one of those things where you just like don't know what it's like until you do it. And I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to like take that leap. confidently, but I guess we'll see. Because I don't belong to a really strong family unit, like my extended family I'm not very close with, and I'm not super close with my parents. And because I don't belong to any sort of like religious community, I feel like I don't have a very clear like reason or methodology or like focus on like why kids should be part of my life. So until I figured that out, I feel like until I figure out why I want to have kids, like a really concrete reason, and feel like it's true for me, I don't think I'm gonna do it.
So
Wow.
there's a lot in that.
Yeah, what an amazing message, first of all. And
Mm-hmm.
I just want to commend the thoughtfulness of this person and how self-aware he seems. And I can
Mm-hmm.
already tell, how much thought has been put into this, or at least the enormity of this decision, which A, it's enormous. B, I mean, it's one of the only things in life that we can't try on for size before committing to. I mean, there's perhaps other examples, but to like such an extent as this, no. I think what he says at the end is really important. Until I find a reason why I want to do this, I'm not going to do it. And I think we should be asking ourselves, why am I choosing this path? And sometimes the answer is as simple as because I don't want to. I mean, that's a great reason, or because I want to.
Mm-hmm.
Parents also say
Mm-hmm.
because I want to. But I think we need to have honesty with ourselves in terms of what our drivers are. And I know there can often be a lot of talk about, good and bad reasons for choosing child free or choosing to have kids. Like, well, if you say you're having kids because you want someone to love or you want to have the connection in your family you didn't have, that's a bad reason, right? Some people might say that. And I think it's more about like, is it a good or bad reason for you? Like, do you think that that is a good reason to have a child? Do you think you can offer that child what that child needs and support them in a way the child needs to be supported? And so, I think having that honesty with ourselves is really important. And I do think that not just doing it because it's the thing we're seeing other people doing, but really being like, why do I personally want this or why do I not want this? Now, I certainly can understand what he's saying about, if we haven't had, for example, like healthy relationships with our own parents or within our own family, or even if we don't have that closeness right now to maybe see, for example, relationships between a sibling and a niece or nephew, it can be hard to know what that may look like for us, or that we don't necessarily have someone that we can speak with about this. But I think if we're willing to do the work for ourselves, and this again, like this is based on a 30-second audio clip, but what I hear is a man that he's so cognizant of what is going on for himself and what his situation has been. And he strikes me as someone who's probably done quite a bit of work as far as his own self-development. And I just think, these are the type of parents that we need in this world.
Mm.
However, just because you would be a great parent doesn't mean you should parent. I think I would be
Mm-hmm.
probably a really good mom in many ways. And yet, for various reasons, it's the path that I've not chosen for myself. And so, yeah, taking a look at things. I guess the last thing I want to offer is, although there's no real way of trying on for size what it is to parent, there is opportunity, I think, to have really honest, open conversations with people that we're not very often having, but to say to people, like, really, like, give me the ins and outs of what it's like to parent. And to ask specific questions, because some people will say, yeah, it's amazing, or it's really freaking hard, but like, what does that mean? What does that entail? And so to have pointed questions, like, what has been most surprising to you since becoming a parent? What stage has been most difficult? What has been some of the good things for your relationship, if you're in a relationship? What have been some of the challenges? And so, like, being selective about what you want to know. I would also offer, although the internet can be, a dumpster fire,
Mm-hmm.
we also sometimes can hear and be witness to conversations that people otherwise would not share. So, for example, on Reddit, there are various groups and subgroups around people. There's like the fence sitters group for people who are trying to decide whether they want to have parents. There's a regretful parents or regretting parenthood
Mm.
thread. And so sometimes you can kind of like, put your ear to the wall, so to speak, and say, what are people saying and what am I hearing that may make me have more awareness of my own situation and like what I recognize or identify.
Mm.
The other piece with that is to spend some time with people's children. And people will say, of course, there's nothing like having your own children, and that someone else's kid or kids may drive you up a wall. But I do think it can give you an idea of, for example, parts of parenting that can be really mundane, because there are parts that are, or some of the challenges that may come up, or even what a daily routine looks like. And if you find yourself, for example, spending a weekend with somebody and their kids, or maybe, during the week going to school, forget about holiday time, but you may see and witness and hear things that make you think, okay, I'm curious, I want to know more, or that make you think, wow, I did not know this was what was involved, right?
Yeah, that's all really, really wonderful advice. And two things that I kind of want to pull out from that is, when we're talking about, like, so many elements are like, one, making this choice for yourself. Yeah. And two, I think it's also really important to, like, center the child in that conversation too. Like, am I bringing a kid in this world to meet, like, an unmet need I had with my family, or these other unmet needs in my life that I'm have not fulfilled? Yeah. Or is it like, am I bringing this child into the world with the capacity to honor that individual life separate of myself? Because even though it's something that comes from you, that being, it's its own form of life, and needing to support it in that.
That's so important.
Yeah. And when they were talking about their relationship with family, it reminded me a bit of the term mother hunger. I recently came across this. Keltie McDaniel, are you familiar with that?
I'm not. And I'm thinking, like, why do I not know about this term and this work?
Yeah, I will share resources with you, and I will link it in the show notes for others listening. But Keltie McDaniel has kind of coined the term mother hunger, which I heard through Ruby Warrington, and it's kind of the adjacent to sober curious. Yeah. And I don't know much, but from what I have surface level pulled from it, it seems like mother hunger, like, exists on a spectrum. And it names, like, these invisible wounds of maybe, like, missing comfort or safety or guidance from our caregivers. And that can cause aversion to wanting to step into parenthood, or that can cause, like, a desire to, like, have those unmet needs filled. So, like, really seeing it as, like, a hunger, like something, like, needs to
be sated.
And something inside of you. So that's just, I'll link that for listeners to explore mother hunger, but I think it's a really curious thing to think about as well. And, like, what were our stories told from our parents being passed down about, like, did they regret having kids? Were they honest with us about what it was like? Or did they always put on a smile and act like it was the best thing in the world, Having more and more spaces where we can explore our own rearing with that and how it impacts us in the decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because now my suspicion is Ruby Warrington probably refers to this work in Women Without Kids, which is a book I've read. And I've also had Ruby Warrington, she's appearing on my podcast relatively soon. We've had that conversation already. So yeah, I know, fangirl moment, right? She's fantastic. So, and actually Ruby and I talk about this idea of this motherhood spectrum, which I also want to just kind of give voice to. And the idea, just like we know, for example, that sexuality exists on a continuum. It's a spectrum. It's like we've so often thought that people are either gay or they're straight, and it's this or it's that, but they've actually shown that there can be sort of this, like, gradient in between, so to speak, and that can shift and change. And similarly with the motherhood spectrum, what she refers to or talks about is this idea that, like, some of us aren't necessarily positioned on one end or the other of, like, I really am inclined to, or well set up to be, or, personally am the kind of person who would want to be a mom. And nor are we adamantly on that child-free side, but we may exist somewhere in the middle. And it's that ambivalence and uncertainty and that gray zone that is so difficult and uncomfortable for us, I think, culturally speaking, because we want things to be straightforward. We revere what is, the black and the white. So it's now, of course, I'd love to actually get into Kelly's work around this, but I'm thinking, I was a bad student. I think I know about this already.
No, you are not. There's so much to unpack.
Yeah.
But I do really love what you're saying about so much of life we want to be black and white, but that's not whole. And
No.
in my experience with certainty and doubt, and really everything in life, like you can't have one without the other. So like within every certainty, there is doubt. And with every doubt, there's a bit of certainty. Like we can hold both. So I think sometimes we think like, oh, I will definitely know 100% for sure. Like, yes, I'm supposed to be a mom. I'm going to feel that way every day for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
But you're, in my opinion, not. That